Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of digital fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn. Today's video is a little bit different. This is episode 1 of a new series I'm doing, a weekly series I think it will be, called Shake the Salt. And the idea here is there are a lot of things that myself and most of the Magic community, at least the community that visits my chat, have an issue with in Magic. And I really think each week we can kind of dive deep into one of those issues and talk about it, and talk about maybe why it's such a problem, why it might potentially be fixed, how it could be fixed, and that sort of thing. This week, I wanted to start with something that's been on my mind for quite a while, and that's this crazy new standard rotation that we're dealing with. Now, a lot of content creators chimed in when news first reached us that they were extending rotation to 3 years instead of 2, and poured their thoughts out about it, but I think there are some subtle ways in which this 3-year rotation affects Magic, affects Standard, in very negative ways that haven't really been addressed. So I want to talk about all of the issues and really make my case for why this should not be a thing. We are now in the Wild West. This is an R&D untested format. So those of you who don't know already, the way R&D works is at any given time, research and development at Wizards of the Coast, they are playtesting the version of Standard that's going to exist 1.5 years from now. So 18 months from now, whatever sets will be out, whatever that Standard format looks like, that's what R&D is testing right now. And they're doing this with playtest versions of cards without the art. They're doing this editing on the fly, changing cards week to week as balancing issues come up. You know, if a card's too powerful, they'll nerf it down for the next set of testing. If a card is too weak and being unplayed, they'll maybe buff it up. And they're testing exactly what Standard's going to look like 1.5 years from now. But with this new 3-year rotation, and it having been announced at the very last minute, there was actually no testing for the way this format is going to look over the course of the next year. They just started testing with these new implementations shortly before they announced Standard rotation. So the first version of Standard we're going to see that's fully been tested by R&D is over 1 year away at this point, which is kind of insane because there are already problematic cards that slip through the cracks of R&D, even with the testing that they give it right now. And that's going to lead to more problems. Everyone knows that Oko was a problematic card. It got banned right away. And that was not even dealing with a 3-year standard. That was a 2-year standard. And still, somehow, Wizards goofed, wasn't able to test that card appropriately, or that standard environment with that card appropriately. It slipped through the cracks, immediately needed to be banned. And we've seen some other cards in a similar situation, like Uro, or my personal Bane, Invoke Despair. Thank God that card is gone. But there are constantly cards here and there slipping through the cracks of R&D and making it into the Standard format, being released for a Standard set, and realizing afterwards that it's just too powerful and it creates a lot of problems within the Standard environment, and then it needs to be banned. But if now R&D has a completely untested format that they are trying to play catch up on and figure out, oh god, like, there are cards from that first year of Standard that are still here that shouldn't be here. Which of those cards interacts with these new cards that are coming out that we never even tested those interactions, and now is going to lead to a very broken synergy. And it's a huge problem, and it's going to result in even more bans. Situations like Oko and Uro, they're going to pop up way more often because it's the Wild West. Everything is untested. And if R&D couldn't keep up with it before and let stuff like that slip through, how are they going to now keep up with a 3-year standard with a bigger card pool and something that they haven't even tested yet, and now they're trying to play catch up on testing the format as it's going to look over the next year? it's just going to lead to way more bans. And those bans are going to make the format even less tested than it already was. Because whenever you have a ban, that version of Standard, where that card is banned, was never anticipated, and therefore it was never tested. So every time R&D bans something, we're now playing a version of Standard that was never tested, that never existed, and we don't know the ramifications. One of the biggest examples of this is the Meat Hook Massacre. When that card became banned, there was no version of Standard tested without black sweepers of that caliber in it. Every version of Standard for the sets coming after Innistrad was tested with Meat Hook Massacre as part of the card pool and balanced, taking into account the fact that Meat Hook Massacre was going to be there to be a sweeper, to balance out certain things like aggro decks, etc. So now that that card's removed from Standard, this version of Standard is slightly more untested, and there are going to be decks that were somewhat balanced because you could use the Meat Hook Massacre against them that are now going to be a little bit more powerful because the Meat Hook Massacre is not in Standard and can't be used against those decks. So it skews the meta and makes the meta a little more untested and makes certain decks more powerful and certain decks less powerful than they ever were in R&D testing, which is a huge problem. And now that we're going to see a ton more bans coming, and you can be in denial if you want about that, but there's no way an extra year in Standard and already R&D can't deal with a 2-year Standard and let stuff slip through that needs to get banned. There's no way that a 3-year Standard that's got an even bigger card pool, that's going to be even harder to play test, that hasn't been tested and they need to play catch up with, there's no way there aren't going to be a big influx of bans coming. So the fact that there's all these new bans that are going to be announced, and it'll trickle in. It's not going to start like crazy, but as another set gets released and then another set gets released without anything rotating, there's going to be more and more broken combinations with stuff that R&D didn't foresee, and those bans are going to happen, and that's going to push us even more into untested territory, and it's going to be hugely problematic. And that leads us to my third issue. There is a much bigger card pool. A card pool that brings Standard closer to feeling like something like Explorer or Pioneer. Now, as a format gets older and the card pool increases, the power level of the decks at the top increase as well, which is why Explorer decks are more powerful than Standard decks. And Pioneer decks are more powerful than Explorer decks, and Modern decks are more powerful than Pioneer decks. Like, it's not it's not a coincidence that decks get more powerful as you get older. And part of that is because, you know, some of the old cards are really busted, but a big part of that is just because it's a bigger card pool. There are more opportunities for combinations to do things that somewhat lean towards breaking the game or breaking a certain, you know, deck type or whatever the case may be. So the bigger the card pool gets, the more powerful the decks at the top, the decks in charge, the decks that are the meta are going to be, which means the less likely a new brew, a rogue deck, so to speak, is going to be able to compete with the actual meta. And as the difference in power between the brews that people like to create and try to compete with and the meta that's at the top, as that difference escalates and becomes bigger, you're going to see more and more people get upset that they can't build something interesting, new, and unique because it just gets rolled by whatever the top meta decks are, even more so than you're seeing it already right now. And that can be entirely problematic for a few different reasons. First of all, cards that were meant to be pretty good and usable, that were tested as being good usable cards in the format, now are not usable because they're just not powerful enough. And an example of this is Farsight Ritual. Farsight Ritual is a 4-mana instant speed card that's going to net you 2 cards in blue. And it's sort of seems like it's meant to be a replacement for Memory Deluge. Now, Memory Deluge should have rotated out of the standard format in September, but it didn't. And Farsight Ritual would have absolutely been a top pick to replace it if it had. It's not as powerful as Memory Deluge, but it's comparable. And with a smaller format, with the power level of the format down, it would have absolutely been a choice card for certain blue control decks to use to replace Memory Deluge. Now, that card's barely seeing play because it's just not as good as Memory Deluge, and Memory Deluge is still in the format. And you're going to see a lot more of this as more and more sets get released, where there are these cool new cards that you want to play with that seem like awesome replacements for stuff that was in standard or should have been in standard and then rotated but are now still in standard, and they just don't see play because the old cards are still there and they're still the most powerful and they're still being used. So you're going to have less and less new cards actually being good enough to be included in these decks, and ultimately I think less people are actually going to buy new cards as each set comes out and as the power level goes up higher and higher, and as there's less and less room to actually fit any of these new cards into established, powerful, dominant meta archetypes. Which leads to my fourth problem. People will be buying less new cards, and that will lead to a mass exodus when rotation finally does happen. If set after set is being released and people are buying less and less new cards because they've still got this meta deck that's been strong for however many seasons and they barely need to tweak it or update the balances and they can just keep ranking up with it every season, they have less of an incentive to try any of these new cards. They have less of an incentive to say, oh, half my deck just rotated out, I need to come up with a new plan, I need to buy into some of these new cards. So they're buying less cards, they're experimenting less, they're just sticking with their old deck, and then all of a sudden rotation comes next year, and now it's like, oh, almost their whole deck is rotated out, and because they've been buying less and less of these new sets that have been releasing, they're now going to be in a position where, more so than any time in Magic's history, they are going to have less of the card pool that is available in Standard available to them immediately to start building decks with, and they're going to have more cards that they actually need to buy at one point in time in order to get back to a point where they have a deck that's competitive, whether that's in Physical or in Arena, whatever the case may be. You're going to have so many people having their decks just completely rotate out, and having less of these new cards and not being able to build new decks without dropping way more money than they used to in previous rotations. And you're going to see a sizable percentage of those people just leave the game, just stop playing, or only play older formats. And it's going to end up driving more people out of Standard rather than keeping them in Standard. And that's why I think that Wizards' approach here is sort of a double-edged sword, and it's a short-term gain for a long-term loss. They're trying to keep people from leaving right now by letting them keep their cards that are powerful that they can keep playing in Standard. And they're hoping that will get them to stay in Standard and keep taking part in Standard events and such. But it's actually creating a bigger problem down the line for when Standard actually does rotate. It's actually going to be an even bigger, more problematic rotation than it would have been a month ago, and you're going to see way more people just giving up on Standard in droves because of it. And that leads me to my fifth issue. With a bigger card pool, you're actually going to see Standard become more off-putting to new players, which in turn is going to see the growth of the game slow down considerably, even more than it is right now. See, Standard was designed to be a format that was easily accessible to new players. That was the whole point. The idea here is, oh, you've never played Magic before? You don't have 10, 20 years worth of cards built up in your collection that you can build sick decks out of? Don't worry about it. This format is our premier format, and you only need cards from the last 2 years. So you can come in, you can just buy some of the newer stuff, and manage to put together a deck that's somewhat competitive and at least stands a chance without having to worry about spending as much money, without having to worry about buying cards from as many sets, without having to worry about cards that are older than 2 years old, and trying to track down, you know, these older cards that are more expensive in order to just be relevant and competitive and to have a chance. And now that we're going to see a 3-year standard instead of 2, it means new players have a much more daunting task. Now, a year from now, when new players try to come into the format or try to come into the game in general, they're going to look at standard, and instead of seeing the format that's for them, that's supposed to be more accessible, now they have this giant card pool of 3 years worth of cards instead of 2, and they're like, oh god, in order to stand a chance against these decks that are way more powerful than they used to be because of the increased card pool, I have to buy cards from all of these sets. I have to put together a deck that's the best of the best from each of these 3 years worth of sets in order to stand a chance. And that's going to feel that much daunting, require that much more money, and be that much more off-putting to new players. So you're going to see less and less new players come into the game. You're going to see the growth of new players being added to the game really slow down. And it's going to have the opposite effect of what Wizards is hoping for. It's not going to grow Magic, especially Standard. It's going to shrink it. And it's going to be incredibly problematic. So to wrap up, we have a completely untested format that's going to result in way more bans than normal, which is going to make that format even more untested than it already was. It's going to feel like the Wild West. There's going to be a new problem card or problem combo every month, and it's going to make all of us cringe. It's going to be completely off-putting to new players. They're not going to want to invest in the format. It's going to be too hard to keep up with it because there's just too many cards. The card pool is too big. People are going to buy less of the new cards and be that much more apt to leave once rotation finally happens, and the bigger card pool means a stronger meta decks to the point where it's going to be way too hard to compete with anything new and interesting that you're brewing. Even after rotation, the meta is going to be as strong and as plentiful right after rotation, more so than it ever used to be right before rotation. Usually, a standard set is its most, or a standard format is its most powerful right before rotation because there's the most amount of sets. But right now, the smallest version of standard format that will exist right after rotation is going to be one set bigger than standard ever used to be in the past at its biggest, which means even at its smallest, the card pool is going to be huge, and the power level of the decks is going to be astronomical, and no one's going to be able to keep up. You're not going to be able to brew new and interesting decks. People are going to get sick of having to face these ultra powerful meta decks, and it's going to be absolutely atrocious. So it's going to be really bad. It's going to get really bad before it gets any better, and I'm really hoping Wizards notices this before it's too late, but there are solutions, and I think Wizards is going in the wrong direction here, and I think what Wizards really needs to do as a solution is change the way rotation works at its core. So the reason rotation happens once a year comes from a time when Magic was new, the internet was new, and there wasn't much of it around, and it was a lot harder to educate people about what sets were legal and what weren't in a particular format environment. Because it was, when you made those announcements, it took a while for it to make it into people's hands or into people's ears. And so, you know, it was smart at first when Magic was new in the 90s to be like, hey, let's make one standard rotation once a year. That way people have plenty of time to get ready for it. And then when it happens, we have plenty of time to get that news out to everybody, make sure they understand the format. And then once they know what the format is, they don't have to worry about it changing on them month to month or whatever the case may be. They don't have to worry about it changing for another year. But these days, we're living in the age of information. with the internet everywhere, it's so easy to update people constantly. And that seems to be happening in a lot of other aspects of Magic the Gathering. And I think rotation could take a page out of that book and really make a rotation work set by set. I don't think there's any reason to rotate just once a year. I think it's archaic. I think you find how many sets is the sweet spot. So the old 2-year rotation, you had, it felt like right before rotation, you had a little bit too many cards. You know, the card pool was a little bit too big, and the decks were a little bit too powerful, and it was a little bit too hard to make a unique, interesting deck and have it compete. Right after rotation, there were way too few sets, and because of that, the card pool was too small, and it was too hard to really build anything interesting because there just wasn't enough of a card pool to have more ideas than you otherwise could. And a lot of times right after rotation, the best decks either devolved down to just aggro because it was just easy, or a particularly powerful set mechanic. And an example I'll use for that is Throne of Eldraine with Adventures. Right after rotation, when Throne of Eldraine was still legal, Adventures decks just took over because there was no reason to play outside of that archetype, even though that archetype only existed in just one set, because playing outside of it diluted the power of your adventure shell, and didn't provide enough extra power to make up for it because the card pool was so small after rotation. So you have less interesting decks that are more focused on a block mechanic right after rotation because the card pool just isn't big enough. But right before rotation, there's way too many options. There's an embarrassment of riches. The meta decks are super powerful. People are annoyed. The card pool is too big. And so I think the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle there. You find that sweet spot, maybe it's 6 sets, and you keep standard at a constant. We'll use 6 sets as the example. You keep standard at 6 sets forever. When a new set rotates in, you rotate out the oldest set. You have a rotation that comes along with each set. And that way, every single set stays in standard for the same amount of time. You get rid of the problem where certain sets were only in standard for a little over a year. If they were the last set to release right before rotation happened, they'd only be in standard for that next full year, and then rotation happens again and they're gone. And then you have other sets that are, they come out as the first set right after rotation, and they stay in standard for a full 2 years. So you get rid of that problematic scenario where certain sets are in standard for a lot less than other sets, and you get rid of that problematic situation where people are less willing to invest in those sets that are in standard for a less amount of time because they know, in 8 months, 9 months, 10 months, whatever it might be, this set is just rotating out, even though it just came out a few months ago. I'm not going to bother to craft these wild cards. I'm not going to bother to buy these cards for my physical deck because they're just going to rotate too soon. You get rid of that problem as well. You can keep standard at a very defined card pool that is the sweet spot between not too many cards where everything's overpowered, but not so little that you don't have enough options to make really interesting, unique brews. And then you just keep it at that sweet spot. You rotate one set at a time as a new set comes out, and standard should, knock on wood, stay healthy for the long term if you do that. People are no longer scared to spend money or wild cards on cards from a newer set that's going to rotate quicker than other sets because every set rotates after it's been in standard for the same amount of time. Not only that, but you're keeping the game fresher more consistently. With rotation happening every set, you're constantly keeping the game fresh. You're constantly keeping everyone on their toes. And you're also making it so that instead of people's decks that they cherish, that they've been playing for a while, instead of having a rotation where a whole year of cards just leaves, and now half their deck or more is gone, and they have to build a whole new deck from scratch, if you have sets leave one at a time, people's decks start to slowly drop off in power. They start to slowly lose a couple cards here or maybe a couple cards there instead of half their deck all at once. And so they can start to adjust. And as they start to adjust and change their decks to find replacements for the 1 or 2 cards that, you know, cycled out, they're also starting to explore maybe new archetypes to build and get into. And so by the time that old deck now becomes completely unusable because 3 or 4 sets worth of cards have rotated out and the power level has gone down considerably, they've had time to build up these other decks to replace it. And they're like, well, my old deck isn't powerful enough to use anymore, but in the meantime, this other deck has been getting more powerful, and now I'll just continue to use this one. So I think it would be a lot healthier for the Magic Standard environment if they rotated sets on a set-by-set basis. They kept the size, the same size at any given time, and they just kept the format healthy by doing that. They wouldn't need to extend rotation to 3 years and drive hordes of people away and be off-putting to new players and cause all of these problems with playtest problems and bannings and all of this. Just keep your standard environment consistent at the number of sets that keeps it the healthiest as possible, and just rotate those sets one at a time to make sure each set gets to stay in standard for a healthy lifespan. That's my solution. I really think it would work. If you think you have a better solution, let me know in the comments below. Or maybe you disagree with me completely and you think I'm off my rocker and that 3-year rotation is just better, which I'm gonna have to say you're crazy if you think that, because all of these problems are going to amount to a massive issue a year from now, and it's just going to get worse and worse with every set, and you'll see over the next year how bad it gets, little by little. It's going to be absurd. Grab your popcorn and eat it, because it's going to be something worth watching. But that's episode 1 of Shake the Salt. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you guys next time. Until then, always make 'em scoop. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.